presenting today is this article. Um, we're going to go over the different parts of the article bits by bits. So let's get into it and start by reading the title. The title is Weight Loss with Naltrexone SR slash bupropion SR combination therapy as an adjunct to behavior modification. And then you have a column here, the core-BMOD trial. Right from the title, you could see that it's a trial, meaning it's an experimental study design. We don't know exactly what type of design it is, but we will be able to tell more as we will read further. One thing you can do after the title, you can actually look at the authors, see their affiliations if you're interested in knowing a little bit about who they are, where they're coming from. It might give you an idea if they were actually recruiting their own patients for the study. Um, you can see that next to every author there is a little number. And then if you skip, we're going to come back to that. But if we skip and you start looking at the footnote over here, it actually explains what these or these authors where they're coming from. So if we go back a little bit up, Thomas Whedon is the primary author. I know this because I've looked at the article previously, but Thomas Whedon is from the Department of Psychiatry, Center for Weight and Eating Disorder, University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA. So you have an idea where that author is coming from. You can see that all different authors, if I'm not mistaken, most of them are coming from School of Medicines, universities, hospitals maybe, except when you reach number 10 and number 11, you will see that number 10 is Inventive Clinical Solutions, and it's based in Houston, Texas. 11 is Oryxigen Therapeutics, and it's in California, USA. Um, 10 and 11, if we go back to the authors, this is Janelle, Holly, Denise, and Eduardo. Now, if you want to know what these are, the inventive clinical solution and the Oryxigen, then you can go all the way till the end of this article. And here they're doing a disclosure and they saying that all academic authors, which probably mean all of them receiving number from 1 to 9, received research grant from Oryxigen Therapeutics. So now we know that Oryxigen, this company, is funding this study. It tells you a little bit about some of the authors have received honoraria for serving on Oryxigen Therapeutics Advisory Board. So few of the authors received honoraria, means they received money without, like they're not actually requesting the money or they're not putting an amount per hour. Honoraria is an amount that you received as a thank you for doing a certain amount of work. You have two more authors have served as paid consultant to the company, so they're being paid for the actual consultant work. And then you have the last three authors, if you remember, these are employees of and hold stock in Oryxigen Therapeutics, and they where GE also works for Inventive Clinical Solution, which is a consultant for Oryxigen Therapeutics. So you kind of have an idea who these authors are, where they're coming from, why are they part of the study, who received money for the work, and etc. So that's a kind of something that is interesting and important. We're going to see later on that Oryxigen is actually the company that makes the drug that is being tested, but we're gonna come back to that later on. I know I'm being very picky and I'm going into the very details of the authors, who they are. You might not need to do that much of an investigation, but if you're interested, you can see that this information usually is provided to you, part of the article information. Next thing I usually like to do is I usually like to read the abstract. Please remember the abstract is a good summary of what this article is, but it should in no way replace the article. So you shouldn't read the abstract and think that's enough. There's still a lot of information that will be provided in the article that you will be missing if you do not read the article. But as I said, it kind of like it's a nice introduction. You kind of puts the mindset into understanding what this study is about. So right from the first sentence, you can see that it's a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So as we suspected, this is an experimental study, but more than so, it's a randomized placebo control. So it's an RCT full experimental. And what it examines is efficacy and safety of the drug. So if you remember, we talked about what is efficacy versus effectiveness. Efficacy looks at the actual impact of the medication in quote unquote perfect setting, versus effectiveness is the efficacy of the medication plus the setting, the human aspect, the natural occurrences that happen in real life scenarios. Safety, the next outcome is, as you might expect, side effects and things like that. Okay, so they're looking at the efficacy and safety of naltrexone plus bupropion as an adjunct. So it's in addition to intensive behavioral modification, BMOD. So whenever we're going to see BMOD, this is the intensive behavior modification. Then they tell you that the total sample was 793 participants. They give you their BMI. Obviously, this BMI is clear that these are obese. Was randomly, so the 793 was randomly assigned in a 1 to 3 ratio for placebo with BMOD. So either everybody is getting behavior modification therapy. So one group received the placebo with the BMOD 202, whereas the second group received the naltrexone sustained release combined with bupropion sustained release plus the BMOD, and the number is 591. Now you notice that the ratio is not 1 to 1. So they're not putting one person in the placebo versus one person in the treatment. On the contrary, they're putting one in a placebo, three in the treatment. And if you look up the reason behind that, if you were interested in knowing why would you do an unbalanced design for a clinical trial, this is usually done when you want to show or double check or make sure that a certain treatment work. So if I remember correctly, like the actual term utilized for when would you do an unbalanced RCT where you're putting more in the treatment versus the placebo, I think the term they used is to exonerate or to, exonerate the treatment. Like you know that the treatment work from previous studies, but you have to make sure that like you need additional evidence. Okay, the next thing I want to point out as you're reading the abstract is that here they have identified co-primary endpoints. Remember we talked about primary endpoint and the difference between that and the secondary endpoint and the importance of these definitions in terms of powering the study. Well, it seems here they have more than one primary endpoint, meaning that it is important for the study to have sufficient power for each and every one of these endpoints. So what are these endpoints? So the first one was percentage change in weight, so that's one, and the proportion of participants who lost more than 5% weight at 56 weeks. So that's the two primary outcome. What is the percentage of weight they lost in general, and what percentage lost more than 5% of their weight? Then they talk about the efficacy analysis. Okay, so like the efficacy is when you looking at how efficacious they performed a modified intent to treat population analysis. So you've heard me before talk about the intention to treat analysis, and that's where you're after randomization. If individual switch for some reason, or if you switch them as the study is going on, or maybe someone stops taking the medication or the placebo, you try as much as possible keep them in the arm that they were randomized to, and you run your analysis as if they stayed in that arm. This is a pure intention to treat analysis. You know, once randomized, you stay there. The intent the modified intention to treat, and they explain it, is where after randomization, you have to have at least one post baseline weight taken while on the drug. Meaning that if for some reason somebody after randomization they switched the medication, they stopped their medication, and there is no one post baseline measurement taken, then you will not include them in the analysis. And actually, you can see that if you look at the placebo, the number of placebo was 202. However, in this type of analysis, the number is 193. So about 9 were excluded from the placebo arm, and if you look at the treatment arm, 591, whereas in this analysis they were 481, meaning about 110 were uh, were not participating in this analysis because they did not meet the criteria for the modified intention to treat analysis. According to our definition, if we were doing a pure modified intention, a pure intention to treat analysis, and if I had no, if I had data, then I would be comparing the 202 to the 591. Next thing they talk about is missing data, which is something that will happen in the majority of the studies. You will have missing data. And the way they're going to address that is with missing data will be replaced with the last observation obtained carried forward. And they'll talk about carried forward in a second, but I mentioned it, meaning that if you came for 6 months and the last time you as a patient being followed up in in the study was at 6 months, and I was looking at your body weight changing, and then you stop coming to the study, well, I will consider the last time I observed you is your weight at the end of the study. So I will carry the last observation till the end of the study. And that it actually puts it makes the analysis harder, because in principle someone losing weight at 6 months, they will continue losing weight. When you're stopping at 6 months, you're making it harder for you as a researcher to find a statistical significance. Okay, so now they start reporting some results at week 56. Remember, the study is for 56. The weight loss was 5.1% with the placebo. So the placebo arm did lose weight, and that's not surprising because they were actually going through the behavior modification. However, those that were taking the medication, the naltrexone bupropion arm, lost 9.3%, so almost double, and p-value was statistically significant. Now, here's another analysis that they did not mention previously. They talk about a completers analysis revealed a weight loss of 7.3 in the first group. And what I want you to look here is at the sample size. The sample size now in the placebo is 106 compared to 202. So out of the 202 that were randomly assigned to placebo, only 1 of 6 completed the study. Only 1 of 6 were completely followed for the 56 weeks. So this is quote unquote the per protocol analysis. Okay, and then if you look at the treatment arm, we have 301. Remember, those that were randomly allocated to the treatment arm were 591. Only 301 completed the study. So far we have the modified intention to treat, and we have the completers. A third analysis, which included all randomized participants. So now we're talking about all randomized participants. That sounds like an intention to treat and not a modified intention to treat, meaning this third analysis Sounds like they were comparing the 202, the original 202, to the 591. The minute you are randomized, you're going to be included in this analysis. And that yielded a weight loss of 4.9 in the placebo versus 7.8 in the treatment. Now, if you take a second to think about these results, if we look at the completers, you will see that the results of the completers, 7.3 in the placebo versus 11.5 in the treatment, this is where you're seeing the strongest results, the strongest weight loss in both the groups, because these are the ones that actually went through the program till the end. Next, you're going to see the modified intention to treat, where you had to had at least 1 week or one observation or two or more observations. No, one or more. Here we go. It's one or more after being randomized. So you will see that the results 5.1 versus 9.3, and the weakest results are for the all randomized, and that shouldn't be a surprise, because all randomized, this is, you're looking at them regardless of what happened to them. You have people that are randomized and never took the medication, never were followed up, and yet you're including them in the analysis, and you're going to see the weaker results. Now, interestingly here is that no matter what kind of analysis, they're seeing a statistical significance everywhere, and always the treatment are doing better than the placebo. Finally, they talk about the conclusion, and they give a little bit of information about the conclusion. So I like the study because the abstract, although usually the abstract is somewhere where you're not going to see a lot of information, is packed of information, packed with a lot of good information. It puts us in the mindset of what is coming. It introduces the modified intention to treat, the completers, the all randomized, the unbalanced design. So we're ready for what is coming. Next, as you usually do, is you read your introduction. You'll see that the introduction is written in the way you would think an introduction should be written. They introduce naltrexone, they introduce bupropion, they give you some literature review about these two medications. They move to another study where it's even a longer follow-up. And then at one point in time, they start introducing the problem of what is missing. So the mechanism by which these two medication combination induced weight loss are not entirely understood. They talk more about what is probably happening. And then this leads to the final and last section of the introduction, where they're going to tell us what is the aim of the study. So the present 56 study assesses the safety and efficacy of the naltrexone sustainable release bupropion sustainable release combination, between parentheses contrav. So that's actually the brand name of the medication. And if you look it up, that medication is made by the company we mentioned previously. So they're going to compare the safety and efficacy of this medication as compared with placebo, each of which was combined with an intensive program of diet, exercise, and behavior therapy. So it's not only the medication, it's diet, exercise, behavior therapy, on top of which the medication. And then they tell you why they added the behavioral therapy, because it was recommended by the NIH. And the last thing, which is very important as well, they say that this trial, represents one of 4 phase 3 studies. So there is 4 phase 3 clinical trials. You should be familiar with what is a phase 3 study. And there are 4 of them. They're all targeting the same drug, but maybe in different population, different target group. This is one of them, which together, so these 4 studies together create the Oryxigen Therapeutics Contrav Obesity Research Program core. All right, so you see that the medication Contrav is by Oryxigen. All right, so next what we have to look at is the methods and the procedure, and see what we can learn further. Looking at the study design, you're going to see that the method and the procedure is divided in two sections, and this is very helpful. It tells us exactly what we're looking at. So, the study design, they tell us that it was 56 weeks. It was a multi center, meaning that the participants were recruited from different centers, randomized, double blind. So, we knew it was randomized, double blind. So participants don't know what they're taking, and whoever is doing the assessment for the weight later on also doesn't know what they're taking. A placebo-controlled trial, meaning that some people took the active ingredient and some took the placebo. Also very important is that there was an IRB review board approval from each institution. So these multi-center, each one of them provided IRB approval, and participants provided written informed consent. So they were asked to give their consent. And finally, they talked that they mentioned that the study followed the Declaration of Helsinki for good clinical practice standards. Next, they're going to tell you about the participants, where they got them. So they got them from 9 academic medical center in the United States. And if you remember, I told you when you look at the authors, they're receiving 1 to 9. And then 10, 11 were the two corporations or pharma company. But 1 to 9, there were different medical institutions. So the authors were coming from different medical institutions. And that's what I think that serves. So every author was probably recruiting for the study, being the key person for recruitment for the study in their own academic center. So that's the 9. We're not surprised about that. Um, they let us know a little bit about like who they went who went goes into the study. Obviously they had to be obese. There were few exclusion criteria, which is typical of any study. When you're reading this description, it's very important that you keep in mind who was excluded, so that the interpretation of the results has to be cognizant of who was not participating in the study, not to reach too much in our generalization of the results to groups that were not part of the study. Interestingly enough, smokers and those who had used tobacco and other nicotine products within 6 months before screening were excluded. So current smokers and those who had used tobacco, which is honestly a large portion of participants to be excluded, and I don't know why, and they don't explain why, at least here in the study, why they had excluded these participants. But for me, that has to be clear in my mind when I'm reading this article. A pharmacist or as a physician, I need to understand that these results do not apply to smokers. Also excluded patients with serious psychiatric illness, which is typical, that really usually is the case. Next on the method is the procedure. So how did they recruit and randomize? And so following a screening, make sure if they meet the inclusion exclusion criteria, participants were randomized via a centralized automated voice response system and a 1 to 3 ratio. We already talked about the 1 to 3 ratio, stratified by study center. Remember we talked about stratification. So every center, when they had 9 center, every center had their own randomization done locally, 1 to 3 placebo versus treatment. And I thought this is interesting, and it's good that we look at that. So they talk a little bit about what was the treatment, and then here, towards the end of this section, participant who discontinued medication. Remember, I told you there's those that will not stay with you till the end of the study. So what do we do with these? In this study, what they said is that if participants who discontinued medication before the end of the study, so before the end of the 56 weeks, were encouraged to remain in the behavior modification program and to return for the scheduled study assessment visit at week 28 and 56. So even though they were not taking medication, they asked them to come back after 28 weeks and to come back after 56 weeks for weight measure and circumference. And this is going to help them in their intention to treat analysis or the full randomized analysis, if you remember. However, these will not be part of the completers analysis. Okay, so participant had study visits at baseline and every 4 weeks. So usually participants had to come back every 4 weeks. Remember the modified intention to treat analysis talked about at least one observation on treatment post baseline. So once they are recruited, this is the baseline assessment. They give them the treatment and they ask them to come back every 4 weeks. So if someone doesn't come back within the first 4 weeks and then you lose them, then you are supposed to keep them if you're doing a modified intention to treat intention to treat analysis. However, in the modified intention to treat, you're allowed not to keep them in your analysis. The next part of the article, they're going to talk about the behavior modification, and they're going to talk about how it includes different things, including a dietitian, looking at the diet, a behavior psychologist, and exercise. So they asked them to do three things. There was the behavior modification therapy, there was the change in the diet, and exercise. And they go over explaining each one of them, like a balanced diet, vigorous physical activity, etc. Then they talk about the outcome measures. Here we're going to encounter the primary endpoint. And remember, they said that they had multiple, they had actually two co-primary. One is the percent change in baseline body weight at week 56. That's the first primary outcome. And the second is what percentage of the participant lost 5% or more of their weight by week 56. So let's suppose you had a participant who's 100 kilograms. If they lose 5 kilograms by the end of the study, they will be considered a success, quote unquote, in number two. Okay? If they lost 6 kilograms, they will be considered a success number two. If they lost 4 kilograms, that 4% of their initial weight, they will not be considered a success part of number two. We know that there's also something called secondary endpoint, and they do mention secondary endpoint, and those are those that lost more than 10%. Obviously, to lose more than 10% means that you lost 5% already. So in the second one, everybody who's part of the 5% will be included. No, I'm sorry, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. Everybody who lost more than 10% will have lost 5%, but not everybody that lost 5% will be part of the 10%. So what I mean here is that if you have 20 that lost more than 10%, then all of these 20 are part of the primary outcome. But not all of those that were in the primary outcome will be in the secondary outcome. Meaning the secondary outcome will have less people, and therefore it will be even harder to detect statistical significance on the secondary outcome because the effect size is larger. And then they went even one step further, looking at the 15%. But here they talk about it as an exploratory outcome, not even a secondary outcome. It's just an exploratory. Let's see what happens if we push it to 15%. Will we have enough difference to detect statistical significance? Another outcome measure are the markers of cardiovascular cardiometabolic rate, and so these are the waist circumference that they were measured, and they tell you exactly where they were measured. The fasting blood sample as well were taken to look at triglyceride, low density lipoprotein, so LDL, HDL. Really, what is nice about this article is they go exactly step by step explaining what they looked at, what they measured, how they measured it, how they looked at it. So really, that's one of the nice articles. They also looked at the psychosocial status and food craving. So they measured something called the quality of life light questionnaire. So quality of life is a concept that you will see more and more. And this is like how well the quality of life of the person is. They also looked at something called the food craving inventory, meaning maybe they checked at how much the participants were craving food. And then the last outcome measure are the safety items. that we're aware of because they already told us that they're going to look at efficacy and safety. So they're looking at systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and they tell you exactly how they did it. Also, they looked at mood using the inventory of depressive symptomology self-report. This is probably a questionnaire where you're asked different questions, and these questions actually they explain this, like an irritability, anxiety, suicidality, making sure that the mental health of the participants are well evaluated and assessed for any problem that may emerge at any point in time um, on the study. So that does not conclude methodology, but it brings us to the last section of methodology, which typically is statistical analysis, and where they're going to tell you how they analyze the data. So what they're going to tell you here is that they needed for 800 participants. Now we know they didn't recruit 800, but they were quite close to that number. And typically, what you see in this section when they talk about how many they recruited or the sample size required is that you're going to hear something about power and something about effect size. So a total of 800 participants was determined. So they determined that they needed 800 to provide a 99% power. Remember, 99% power is quite high. We've already mentioned that typically, a study requires a minimum of 80% power. So this one is going all the way up to 99% power to detect a 5% point difference between groups in percent change in initial weight. So what that is, this is the effect size that they would like to catch. So for this much of a difference, to achieve a 99% power, they need 800 participants. Assuming the percent change in weight for placebo is about 5% versus 10% so they're assuming that the placebo will lose 5%, the treatment will lose 10%, and they're not that far off from the prediction. If you remember, we read in the abstract what was the percentage lost. So if this is the percentage of weight loss, like 5% and the placebo versus 10%, then they will require 800 participants to achieve 99% power. And then they say that the power will actually be 90% to detect a 14% point difference for the second co-primary endpoint, assuming the proportion of subject. Remember, the secondary endpoint is how many will lose more than 5%. Well, if this is 50% of placebo versus 64 in the treatment arm, well, with 800 participants, they will have 90% power. So long story short, they will have enough power if if the results turn out to be how they predicted they will be. Reading the abstract, we know that for the first primary, they're not that far off. For the second one, they didn't report what percentage lost more than 5%. So we don't know, but we will keep it in mind as we're reading the results once we got there. And then they talk about if the all efficacy were performed on participants in the prescribed, that's one, modified intent to treat population, so the modified ITT, which which include all randomized participants with a baseline measure of body weight. So they're explaining to you what is the modified intention to treat, which we already went over. Unless otherwise indicated, they're going to address the missing individual data. Therefore, we're imputed. Imputed means that when value is missing, it's going to be replaced somehow. So the way they're going to impute, replace missing data, they're going to use, as I mentioned to you earlier, the last observation carried forward, LOCF method, meaning that if you were followed for 20 weeks, and then from 20 to 56 we don't have data on you, we're going to consider that your weight on 20 weeks is going to remain constant for week 21, 22, 23, all the way up to 26. So that's what they did, and it has its advantages and disadvantages. Then they're going to move to talk about the completer analysis, which include all randomized participants who provide measurements of weight at baseline and at week 56. So these are the ones that actually we had them at baseline and we had them at weight 56, and so we know exactly what happened. Then they're going to talk about something called the sensitivity analysis. So, sensitivity analysis, you're going to hear more and more about that. This is what is also known as what if analysis, meaning that what if we change some of the definitions or the criteria or the cut points? How would that impact our results? So, let's see what they say about their their sensitivity. So, two sensitivity analyses were conducted to determine the effect of excluding from the primary analysis participants who did not provide a post baseline measure on weight on drug on study drug. All right. So their sensitivity analysis is that they're going to exclude some participants to see that what if we exclude those, how much our results are going to be impacted. And you can see that there's over here the first sensitivity analysis where they go over how they did it, the second sensitivity analysis, and they also tell you how they analyzed it. Then they moved into the safety were performed, including, let's see, so they tell you who they compared for the safety analysis, and then they're going to talk about what measures or what statistical test they use. Let me see if I can find that quickly. So if you keep reading the statistical methodology, it's quite extensive. At this point, they start discussing what statistical test and methodology you use, which might be a bit advanced for you when you're reading. But as you're reading, you can distinct few terms here and there, and they can make sense to what you're doing. So, for example, um, I'm hoping that you can understand a little bit what they're they're mentioning here. The proportion of participants who achieve different weight loss categories, remember, more than 5%, more than 10%, more than 15%. These were analyzed using logistic regression model that included treatment, whether they're taking the placebo or the placebo treatment, and study center, so the nine study center, and baseline body weight as covariate. So this is a quote unquote adjusted effect. Uh, Wondering maybe like there was a potential confounding for which study center they're coming from, um, or if the initial baseline body weight played a role, they adjusted for that. Um, Also, you can see that they mentioned that the difference between the group on baseline characteristics were checked, and that is typical of a clinical trial. You would expect table 1 to be comparing the placebo to the treatment arm to see if they differ at baseline. What is unusual in this article is that they're talking about table 1 part of the statistical methodology and not part of the results. But at any rate, we'll come back to that in a second. Then again, if you can continue reading, there are a few items in the write-up of the statistical methodology that might be meaningful. We can see that they address the secondary endpoint in their analysis, and they address the fact that they're doing a lot of analysis. Therefore, they had a strategy of how to analyze things, and at each point and then at one point they will reach where the results are considered to be exploratory rather than any statistical significance. And that is very interesting and very important from their part to actually address that. Kamin, what is typical when you're reading statistical methodology toward the end is to indicate what statistical software they used, and they may also talk about the p-value being considered statistically significant if it's less than 5%, or like all analyses were carried at the 5% statistical significance or something like that. Um, so we finished the statistical analysis and we're ready for the results. So quickly, I'm going to go and look at figure one. Figure one is a very important figure. This is called the flow chart or the consort flow chart, and that what that does, it follows up the participants after randomization. So you can see that we started off with 793, 202 were randomized in the placebo, and 591 randomized in the treatment. But then what happens? And as you're moving along, you can see that there will be further splits. So if you look at the placebo arm, you have right away, right after the randomization, you have discontinued drug treatment with no post-baseline weight measure on drug. Yani they were randomized. They were told that you're going to take this placebo. They didn't know this drug, quote unquote, and we want you to come back after 4 weeks. Well, nine individuals never came back. We never saw them again. Whereas the 193 actually continued and they did come back for at least one measure. And here they tell you that these were the individual with more than one or more post-baseline measurement, and they will be included in the modified intention to treat analysis. If we're doing a usual intention to treat analysis, well, these two will be combined together regardless. All right, then what happens? Well, if we keep continuing, and you're going to see the same thing on the treatment arm. You have those that never came back, and you can see that it's about 18.4% in the treatment arm never came back, not even once, versus 81% came back, versus in the placebo, it was only 4.5. And what you need to do as you're reading this flow chart, you need to consider what is happening, where are we losing more people? Is there a reason why this percentage is so much higher than this percentage? I would argue that, yes, I would argue that maybe they suffered from adverse event, side effects, and they didn't like the drug and they did not want to come back. But since they never came back, we don't know if we will see them ever again and if we will be able to assess what happened to them. So that's how you need to look at this flow chart and have a critical mindset in terms of the results. Okay, so then what happens? Well, what happens is that those that came for at least one visit, they are split into two categories: the completers, those that kept coming, versus those that discontinued at one point in time. And you will see that you have 37% that discontinued versus 58.4% that completed. If you jump into the other arm, the treatment arm, you'll see that the completers percentage is quite similar to the placebo, but the discontinuation is a bit smaller than the placebo, and that's probably has to do with those that we never saw again. Type, what about the completers? What happened to those? Well, again, those are split into two. Um, those that were the 56 weeks were measured off drug, meaning they did come at 56 weeks. You did measure their weight, but they were not taking the medication. Remember, for those that stopped taking the medication, remember that they were asked to come back even if they're stopping the medication. So these are the ones. You have 12 of them that came back for 56, but they were not taking the medication. Versus 102, 106, that they were taking the medication on the last visit, and those will be considered the completer analysis or the per protocol analysis. And you can look at this percentage and compare it over here, and you can see that the percentages are quite comparable, which is a good thing to see. So then, what they do is the discontinuing, those that discontinued, are put together in one box to explain why what happened. So we have 84 that discontinued, meaning 41% in this arm, 42% in this arm, very close. And then they try to explain to you why they discontinued. So you have the adverse event, withdrew consent, lost to follow up, drug non-compliance, da da da. You look, and on this arm, similarly. And it is our job as readers to look at these numbers and see if we detect anything of an oddity. And I noticed that the adverse event represent 12.4% in the placebo versus 25%, the double in the treatment arm. And that is not a bad thing by itself, but all it means that when you're reading this article, you need to keep that in mind when you're reading an article, and you need to ask yourself, will they address that in their write-up? So here there's a little bit of a footnote for figure one, and they go over what I just went over it. Um, One second. And as I said, looking at the footnote, you will see that they actually do mention these two percentages that I highlighted, and they do say that the difference was statistically significant. So we're going to go back a bit for table one. And remember, table one is the table that is going to compare the placebo to the treatment arm. And basically, you're looking at the baseline characteristics in terms of gender, age, race, BMI, weight, etc. And you're trying to make sense on your own if there is a major difference between the two. Hopefully, there shouldn't be any difference because they were randomized, so hopefully, they should be quite similar. But if you find any difference here, then again, you need to make a note of it for yourselves as you're going through the results and what they mean. So we're going to go and plunge into the results. For the results, we're going to rely on the figures. Y- y- Akid, what you need to do is a proper reading of the results. But what I like to do is I like to have the tables and the figures on a separate document. I look at the results, read what the authors are saying, and see if what they're saying actually matches the tables and the results, and if I agree with what they're saying. Because again, when you're reading results, you should feel free to pick your own conclusion and what makes sense or not make sense to you, and then read what the authors are saying and see if you agree or maybe not agree with what they're saying. I know this session is getting very long, so I'm gonna try to cut it short by jumping into the results. So the first thing up for the results is this figure right there, and what you're seeing is the weeks is they're passing, and then you have the change in body weight. So they're losing weight as time is passing. And the white circles represent the placebo arm versus the dark squares represent the treatment arm. And what they're doing is they're showing the results for the modified intention to treat, last observation carried forward. So by now you know what modified intention to treatment is and last observation carried forward is. And also they're looking at the completers. So hopefully you have a good understanding of what these are. And you can see that the results are pretty nice. Everybody's losing weight. The treatment are losing more weight than the placebo. By the week 32, you have some sort of a plateauing, which would be interesting to know if it's typical of people that lose weight. Because remember, you need to lose weight, but you need also to keep it off. And if you look at the completers, you will see that the placebo to placebo and treatment to treatment, the completers tend to have lost more weight than the, uh, the, the modified intention to treat analysis. And that's normal. We predicted that. Next, what they're going to do is they're going to show you the other primary outcome. Remember, so this is primary outcome in terms of what percent lost weight, like what was the percent weight loss. But then they were going to categorize them into 5% or more, 10% or more, 15% or more, where 5% or more is still the primary outcome, 10% or more becomes the secondary outcome, and 15% or more becomes an exploratory outcome. And they're going to show you these results for the modified intention to treat completers and randomized, like the I would say the usual intention to treat analysis, although I might not be completely correct. And so the results are interesting. They're showing that always you have a higher percentage for the treatment versus the placebo. So 66% of the sample in the treatment arm lost more than 5% versus 42 in the placebos, and the difference is statistically significant. As you move into 10%, obviously the percent is reduced, and as you moved into 15%, the percent is further reduced because it's you have less people losing more than 10% and less people losing more than 15%. But what is interesting is that you still see that the treatment is losing more than the placebo, and the difference is statistically significant. So that's for the modified intention treated. As you move to the completers, so those are the ones that completed the study, you will see that consistently for all of the results, the percentages are higher on the completers. And we kind of already knew this when we looked at this figure, we saw that. But still, interestingly enough, we're seeing differences that are statistically significant everywhere. When you move into the randomized, then this is where the weakest results are. And again, you will see that still you're seeing a statistical difference between the two groups, whether it's 5%, 10%, or 15%. And that by itself is an interesting result as efficacy of the treatment. So far, so good. And so again, you're supposed to read the article, look at all the of what they're saying, and check if this makes sense with the numbers. See if you're seeing any discrepancies. See if there's something that they didn't talk about, purposefully or unintentionally. Um, these were the weight loss. Remember that those were not the only results. We had other results pertaining to the cardiometabolic risk in terms of insulin, etc. We had the quality of life results as well, the food craving and the mood part of safety, and all of that you can see adverse events. They actually are reported down here. So in table two, again, you have your placebo and the treatment, and they're showing you these the waist circumference, the triglycerides, the HDL, and it would be important that you look at these results, see what you're saying. Uh, so, for example, you can see that for the change between waist circumference between the two arms is statistically significant. So the drop of 10% versus 6%. For triglycerides as well is significant. So you look at them, you try to make sense of how these results are actually uh, relating to the study, and you try to see if there's any inconsistency or results that are actually flipping from one side to the side, because you will be surprised how many times you'll see something that doesn't make sense, but authors just know, they just present it and continue as if nothing happened. It's important that the authors addresses all the elements of the results and what they mean. um, Over here, we're looking at side effects, and the side effects are into as a score. So you have the physical function, self-esteem, public distress, sexual life, and work. And at different weeks, they're trying to show you if there is a difference between the two arms, placebo and the treatment. And you can see that for total score, uh, again and again and again, you're seeing a higher score for the treatment arm than the placebo. Um, for physical distress, again, it's higher for those taking the medication. For self-esteem as well. For public distress, there's no significance. For sexual life, no significance, and for work. So it's for physical functioning and self-esteem, basically, where you're seeing a high percentage in the treatment versus in the placebo. Again, I'm not going to go over the discussion, but I'm still looking at the results. So an interesting thing to look at for safety is the adverse event between the two arms. And here's your placebo, and here's the treatment. And you can see that consistently there's a higher percentage for nausea, for constipation as well in the treatment, obviously. Um, and as you go over that, what I found to be very interesting is that if you look at the psychiatric adverse event, you will see that depression had a statistical significance, but what is interesting is that it was higher in the placebo than in the treatment arm, which kind of is counter to what everything else is saying. So that is interesting. And as you're reading your article, you expect to see if they're going to talk about this. This actually works in favor of the medication. Um, as we're coming towards the end of this article, as I told you, you have the discussion, and in the discussion, you want to see if the discussion they're sticking to their results, or are they going beyond. If the things they're saying in their discussion actually stems from the results supported by results, or are they just taking like a tiny results and then they're building, like dunes and dunes of comments and meaningful where they shouldn't do that. Also, another thing that you should look for the discussion is limitations. So I can see quite quickly here that they have strengths, they identified strengths of the study. I would expect that they will also talk about limitations of the study. Make sure that they identify their there we go. So they do. They talk about the limitations. Maybe there's some confounding, some bias, something that happened that was not supposed to happen. They have to be transparent and talk about it. Um, Last thing is acknowledgement, and you can see that they talk about the acknowledgement and who's done what. And disclosure, we kind of talk about it. References, so it's important to look at the references, see if the references are recent. If there's any work that has been done recently that hasn't been cited, that you know about in the field and they should have talked about, also it is important. Okay, let's see. Did we cover everything? I think we did. I want to just talk about a couple of things. Just give me a second. One thing that I would like for you to get yourself acquainted with is the consort. What happened here? Oops, sorry. Okay. The consort the checklist. I think you've seen him. You heard me mention that previously. And it's kind of like it does what I did with you now. It goes through the different aspects of the study, and it asks you questions about if they talk about this, did they mention that, did they mention this? And by answering these, you will be able to have a good reflection on whether the study was well done, well prepared, and well presented. So you can see that it starts with the title, goes to the introduction, where the objective clear, the method, the trial design, the participant, the intervention, the sample size, the randomization sequence, the blinding, as I said, well, statistical methodology, the results. Mostly everything we talked about, the discussion, the limitations, the generalizability, any other things about them. For example, registration. I don't know if they mentioned registration in the role of the funding institutions, and all of that you're supposed to look for in your article. If you fill out this table, you've kind of have prepared an evaluation of an article. Another thing I want to talk about, and I already mentioned that, is the flow diagram, the consort flow diagram. And you're supposed to look for that in articles. They're supposed to do that. They're supposed to tell you, how many were eligible, how many were ended up being randomized, because how many were actually excluded due to reasons. In our study, they didn't. They just jumped into the randomization. And then as they are randomized into intervention and placebo, the different numbers and what is happening as the follow-up is happening, who were excluded there, who were dropped out. You need to see something like this in a clinical trial. A good clinical trial will always have a flow diagram or a consort flow diagram, which tells you exactly what is happening to the participants. So also another form that we have prepared at the School of Pharmacy for you to help you review article is this article analysis form. I hope you've seen it somewhere else, or you will see it again in other courses. And we try to kind of like follow the things we discussed with a bit more details. So like we start with the title of the article, and we give you like hints what to look for. The journal, like what kind of journal, who publishes that journal, what kind of affiliation it has, the citation, if this article has been cited, already, and what kind of references it's using, if it's old or new, the authors, who are the authors as I talk to you about it, the purpose and the rationale of the study, the objective, are they clear, are they written appropriately, can you identify the independent, dependent, and the patient population, any funding or conflict of interest. Then in the method, we go through the study design, the enrollment, the setting, patient selection, treatment protocol, the duration, the ethical approval, the endpoints, and with specific questions that you can ask and see if you can find the answer to these questions. And the more answers you find to these questions, the better the study is, or it will help you evaluate these different sections, like for setting, were there different setting or different centers, how different were they, was the setting described, to help you understand the potential selection bias, okay. Sample size and power bias in terms of selection. Then in the results, like were you provided with baseline characteristics, primary, secondary, safety points, or dropouts? Can you find all of this? Are they well presented? The discussion, like did they compare the results to other studies? Did they outline the strength and the limitation of the studies? As I said, like typically the discussion has to stem from the results, and be consistent with the results. I mean, you'll be surprised. Many times you read an article. That's why I say I repeat that a lot. Don't just trust what the authors are saying. Don't just read the introduction and the discussion. You have to read the article to see exactly if the discussion makes sense, if the recommendations, the discussion are stemming out from the results, and are they bound to the population that they studied. Author's contribution, again, like do results support the author's conclusion, and generalizability of the results. See, so that's another type of form that we prepared at School of Pharmacy to help you review articles. So I hope you find this session helpful. Thank you.